We are iConnections, and it's time to talk about change. To work together and rebalance our global systems. To create a more equitable world for everyone. To celebrate women and their achievements. Acknowledge their trials and their triumphs. To challenge biases and recognize that the leadership of women is essential. We choose to invest in our future because equality is non-negotiable for investment. And change emerges from leadership. We must overcome discrimination, challenge gender inequality, and balance our responsibilities.
Every challenge comes with a choice.
I choose to challenge.
I choose to challenge.
We choose to challenge.
Welcome to the next session, Charities and Nonprofits for Change. This session is sponsored by BTIG, a global financial services firm specializing in outsourced trading, prime brokerage, investment banking, and research with over 3,000 institutional and corporate clients worldwide. Nonprofit organizations and the investment leaders who represent them, first and foremost, have a responsibility for their cause. But can they use their power to further change in women's equality? Moderating our session today is Rahul Mudgal, partner at Parvus Asset Management. I'll now turn it over to Rahul to begin our session.
I'm really honored today to be moderating an iConnections panel, Choosing to Challenge, Charities and Nonprofits for Change. Today we have a formidable panel consisting of Anne-Marie Fleurbaaij, who is the Managing Director of Public Equities at Cambridge University's Endowment. She, along with Tilly Franklin, the CIO of Cambridge University, is the co-founder of GAIN, a charity she established to inform and inspire the next generation of young women to enter the investment management industry in the UK. Welcome, Anne-Marie. Also on our panel is Dr. Ruth Owen, CEO of Leonard, Cheshire, a UK-based charity supporting disabled people. Ruth joined Leonard, Cheshire in February after 17 years as CEO of WizKids, a national children's disability charity providing mobility equipment and services to young disabled people. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you.
Tilly and Anne-Marie and Ruth are joined by Tiffany Sprague. Tiffany is an international development consultant at the United Nations Development Programme, where she consults on gender equality in STEM education and careers. Welcome, everyone. Really honored to have you here. Thank you for taking the time. And I would like to start really by just making my personal connection with each of you. Ruth, you and I have worked together for 10 years. And I was a trustee for WizKids. It was incredible to see what you did with that organization. And today we work together on British Exploring Society. Thank you for being a powerhouse for women and for the disabled, but more than anything for the people who don't have a voice. Anne-Marie, I'm wearing my Cambridge tie to just say, thank you for doing an amazing job for Cambridge's Endowment, and thank you for all the work you do with GAIN. I'm doing all that I can to support you within the investment management community. Thank you for doing this and setting up GAIN, because it's a really important cause that we need. Tiff, what can I say? You and I have been friends for, 25 years. You're my most international friend. We studied together in the USA, in Russia, and in the UK. And I was really honored to serve on the board of the charity you co-founded in California, Scientific Adventures for Girls. Thank you for always being an inspiration and for challenging the momentum that needs refreshing. So welcome all of you. I think it'll be really good to start by each of you giving a background to yourselves. And what I'm really interested in is kind of the main things that happened in your childhood that have inspired you to become who you are today, and really what's influenced you to be at the forefront of trying to find and make change in the world we live in. Ruth, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Rahul, and thank you for inviting me today. And it's lovely to be with such great panelists as well. I guess what inspired me as a child, as in my childhood, I think there was one experience that led me to think that I needed to be accountable for my life. I was ill young. I got my first wheelchair when I was 7, and I was ill as a year old from a polio injection. which left me as a full-time wheelchair user. Back then, my parents were encouraged to put me away in an institution, which to give my mother and father some respite. I had a sibling next to me at the time, so there was two of us. So my mother and father did that in an institution in the West Country, and I was there for 3 months on my own. And one of those days, I was probably a bit too cheeky. I always had a voice back then for myself, and I had my wheelchair confiscated, and I was put in a cot with high bars and left there. And I was only going to get my wheelchair back when I was well behaved. What that taught me was, and I was 6, 7. What that taught me was that my life was in my hands. Yes, I had adults around me, but I needed to somehow find a voice to advocate for myself. And I remember that very vividly. After 3 months, I had knotty hair. I had a black eye. My parents come to see me, and my mother, who was a nursing professional, took me out of that home and took me back home. But that was probably one of the greatest impacts on my life. It made me realize that I had to find my voice. And as a woman, and well, a young girl then, I had to somehow fight up against adults. So that was probably the biggest influence. And then I guess the second biggest influence was that my father then went to relocate to Africa. We lived in Africa for a huge amount of my childhood. So those two things, I think, have really shaped my life.
And Ruth, quickly before we move on to Anne-Marie, you actually remember the time before you used a wheelchair when you were able-bodied?
I didn't. I was ill when I was a year old, so I didn't walk from a year. But I was lifted around from chair to chair by my parents till I got my first wheelchair at 7.
Wow, amazing. Anne-Marie?
Yeah, wow. So following on, that's a tough act to follow, but so I'm born and raised in California to immigrants. I've been in London now for 26 years, but truly a first generation American. And my father is Dutch and my mother is Canadian, and neither of them had a university degree. And my father finished high school in post-war Netherlands, and my mother left high school at 15 after her father died, and neither family could really afford to put my parents through higher education. So it's really been no surprise that doing well in school and getting a university degree was always a real priority for me growing up. And I ended up going to the University of California at Berkeley, which was, of course, a very competitive and well-regarded school, but it also benefited very much from being a state-supported school and therefore was less financially costly than private alternatives. And I'd also say that saving and investing was a key theme in my parents' house, in addition to education growing up. And my parents, and especially my father, taught us early on the value of compound interest, although he would never have called it that at the time, and the value of being disciplined in spending and investing. And looking back now, I can see that all of those lessons had a really strong influence on my personal values, but also ultimately my career choices in terms of going into financial services and ultimately becoming an investor. I started my career in San Francisco working for Deloitte & Touche, what was then one of the big 6 accounting firms, and then ultimately moved to Morgan Stanley, where I got my first taste of being a professional investor, sitting alongside actually a large number of senior women. But after having spent 7 years with Morgan Stanley and 12 years with a sovereign wealth fund where I was running various equity portfolios, I could see that there was a dearth of female talent in the industry, not just at senior levels, but also coming up through the ranks. And so this really informed the decision that a bunch of us made to start GAIN, Girls Are Investors, the charity I helped co-found, but it's also informed a lot of our hiring practices at the Cambridge University Endowment Fund, where I joined Tilly Franklin last year as the managing director in Marketable Assets.
Great, thank you. Tiffany?
It's a bit about me. Also, thank you for inviting me to be in this panel, and
Pleasure.
really great to meet all of you. Thank you. Yeah, so I was born in New York to 2 immigrants as well, from the Philippines. My dad is a doctor, my mom is a nurse, and they were looking for a better life, a lot of immigrants. And so I was born there, but then when I was 5, they relocated to Kentucky, which I don't know if you know a lot about Kentucky, but it's in the South and it's quite homogenous. And we didn't live just in Kentucky. We lived in a really tiny town called Hazard, Kentucky. It's probably one of the most rural areas in the US. And I would say this was my formidable years. Like I grew up feeling like I never belonged and without really knowing why. And I have sensitivity to my parents because they were also trying to navigate being immigrants in this, predominantly white rural area that's kind of closed off to the rest of the world. And I just felt like it was hard to make friends. It was hard to join anything, and just constantly people asking me what I was and, where am I really from? And all this, just because of the way I looked. And so I spent most of my childhood trying to figure out how to fit in. So a lot of my choices were driven by what I think I should do or what society wants me to do or what it's like to fit in. And even to this day, I still have a hard time figuring out what it is that I want to do versus what I should do. It just became exhausting, just trying to figure out what people want. And when I got into college, it was just like, this is enough. I want to make the world so that people don't have to justify why they're living just because of the basis of where they're from or the color of their skin or whatnot. And so I got into the nonprofit world and looked for mission-driven organizations to help make the place more inclusive or to leave no one behind. And so I think that was like one of the biggest impacts for me. And I think having this type of childhood, I became a really good listener and really empathetic. And so, those are skills that I've brought into my work to really understand where people are coming from, because, people in Kentucky, it wasn't that they were vicious or it's just, that's what they know. And it's really just bridging and educating people. And so that's what I want to do. I want to bring understanding to people to make the world a bit more inclusive. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned the word their mission, and I'd really like each of you to sort of think about the missions that you work for and how you think about those and whether you can describe them. And really, what are the challenges you face as women in trying to take those missions forward? Do you think that the challenges you face as women would be different if you were men? Anne-Marie, should we start with you?
Sure. So I'm really lucky today in that I'm actually working to serve two missions. One is, of course, to serve the University of Cambridge and its various stakeholders. And the second is as a co-founder and trustee of this charity, Girls Are Investors, or GAIN, which we officially launched in 2019. And GAIN was the brainchild, as I said before, of Tilly Franklin. And she and three of us decided that we needed to address the dearth of young women applying to work in investment management, in which all of us worked. Each of us had recognized the lack of women in investment management at all levels. But while it did seem there was more and more being done and more initiatives aimed at retaining talented women in the industry, there was still really very little being done to address the fact that at the graduate level, just 20% of applications for investment roles were coming from women. And we set up GAIN to encourage young women to consider investment management as a career by asking women already in the industry to speak to sixth form and university aged girls about what they do, with a view that you can't be what you can't see. And many of the girls we reach have never even heard of investment management, or if they have, they might associate it with bad actors like Bernie Madoff or the like, or there's also this really common misconception that investment management is the same thing as investment banking, which of course it's not. So by giving girls really very successful female role models and asking and making investing as a concept more relatable to young women, we hope to dispel some of the misunderstandings around the industry and to get girls excited at the level of pursuing a career in investing. So I would say that the mission is around being a strong female in the industry, if that makes sense.
Totally. Ruth.
I mean, I guess really for me, it's quite simple, really. It's that disabled people have the same opportunities as non-disabled people. If I think about employment, still today, many young disabled people cannot enter the world of work in the way that we're talking today. They still struggle to get those opportunities. They still struggle to have, an independent life or a life that they choose, because the environment around them doesn't allow them to do that. And I think for me, I've always wanted to make sure that the next generation of disabled people have more opportunity than I did. And listen, I was just doggedly determined. Some would probably say very belligerent, probably some would say a right real pain in the ass, but I was quite clear that I wanted to give back and I wanted to do something with my life. I felt just because I had, as I always say, wheels attached to my bum, it didn't mean to say that my brain didn't work. My brain was perfectly able to work. And, yes, there'd be some things that you might have to change slightly for me, but listen, in the great scheme of things, that was nothing. So for me, it's about my mission really is that disabled people have the same opportunities as non-disabled people. And the fact that they're the only minority group that haven't had the same level of change as the rest of other minority groups. For me, that's my mission. And I'm going to do everything I can until the day I hang up my boots to try and change the world for a better place.
Wonderful, Ruth. And you are a force of nature. Having worked for you, you don't take no for an answer. So I love that about you. It's incredible.
Well, I don't know if I think I worked for you, Rahul. You were on the board, so I think I worked for you.
I always felt I worked for you, Ruth. Honestly, you're such an inspiration. You really lead amazingly well. Tiff.
So right now I'm consulting with the UN Development Program, and their mission is to eradicate poverty. And then I work specifically for the gender team out of the Istanbul Regional Hub. And so for the gender team, it's really to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goal, gender equality. And so that's to eradicate, or not eradicate, but to get rid of gender-based discrimination. So that's the mission of the UN. And this program that I'm currently working on, it's called STEM for All. And again, it's just making STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, math fields inclusive, because right now it's predominantly men. And in this region, which is the Central Asia and sort of former Soviet Union countries, there are quite a bit of women in these fields, but not in the decision-making roles. And so when we look at that, and the mission is to really build awareness of the problem, why women are having a hard time advancing in education, STEM careers, and then all the way to the boardroom. It's not, starting from education throughout. So that is the mission, and it's not only a human right, but it's an economic issue. It's a development issue, because in what we're seeing now with the pandemic, a lot of women are losing their jobs because they're part of the service industry. They're part of these industries that are hard hit. And how are we going to reskill them? How are we going to reskill and upskill these people that, the people that are losing their jobs? And a lot of the jobs in demand are going to be in STEM skills. And if women are discriminated against, or it's because of social and cultural norms that they're not pursuing these paths, it's going to be a real problem. So that's my mission. And I'm also a mother to a daughter who, for whatever reason, I don't know, it's just like this, it's a cultural norm or social thing, but she just really has a love-hate relationship with math. And she's like, well, I don't really want to know. I mean, I co-founded Scientific Adventures for Girls. And so I'm just wondering, what it's an issue. It's really hard grained that girls have a harder time with science and math. And it's not really, it's like a confidence issue, and it's how society, opens up those pathways to them. So that is my personal mission as well.
But she's an excellent soccer player, so that's the balancing act that I will say, right, Tiff?
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
She's very well-rounded. She's got an engineer for a father and a mother who is a feminist and really all about pursuing, don't stop at anything. And I don't think she'll have a problem. She's 12 now, so.
Yeah, unbelievable. So if we talk about, we're celebrating International Women's Day this week on iConnections, and this is part of the program. And one of the things I want to talk about is identity. When each of you thinks about identity, how do you think about it, based on the following parameters: ethnicity, nationality, gender, disability, and any other sort of factor you would consider? And there's no right or wrong answer. I'm actually just interested how you think about that, and then really how you take that personal identity and apply it to your mission, and then really applying that to your mission. At what point is the line drawn where it stops being emotional and becomes rational, or stops being rational and becomes emotional? And, you know, Anne-Marie, for you, the part of your work I can really relate to, if you're picking a manager in your portfolio who you love and you believe in his philosophy, but he's having a tough time, at what point do you sort of say, hold on, rationally, this guy is an amazing investor, we should keep him, and he's going to work. Emotionally, I believe in him, but bigger picture, it's not working. How long do I hold on to him? You know, how do you think about those things when you're working and you're trying to challenge the norm and become a change maker? We'll start with you, Anne-Marie.
Sure. So I'm actually not going to talk about that, but there's a lot in there that's really fascinating, because I think, having grown up in California, and especially in the I'm going to date myself, but in the 70s and early 80s, and then having gone to Berkeley, and then gone into finance, I always joke that I'm a bit of a hippie in banker's clothing. Like, I'm a bit of a tree hugger that, you know, still loves to be in finance. And I think that's really informed, again, it's informed a lot of my career choices. And when I think about it, it's less relevant perhaps to GAIN, although I think GAIN is a real manifestation of all of the founders' beliefs that diversity and inclusion in decision making can actually produce far better quality of decisions and better outcomes. I think it's also informed my career decisions in terms of, I sit on the board of the Investor Forum, which advocates for long-term capital stewardship. And I also, in terms of joining the Cambridge University Endowment Fund, where we've recently, last year, implemented frankly, a groundbreaking and sustainable investment strategy where we're committing to net carbon zero in the next 18 years. And, you know, this is a real, I believe very passionately in you know, climate change, and that we need to do something to address it more than just paying lip service to it. So I would say that, you know, you mentioned, how do I identify? At the heart, even though I've lived in London for more than half my life, I still identify myself as this kind of crunchy little California hippie, and it's really kind of it's really kind of bled into my professional career over time, which has frankly given it a lot more meaning and purpose for me.
Do you ever think about your Canadian or your Dutch roots at all? Do you think they've ever had any impact on you, or are you a Californian first and foremost?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't speak Dutch, and you know, again, this is like 100 years ago when I was born. But you know, we didn't have like we didn't kind of fly around the world to see our families that often. So my nuclear family was pretty much it, and we were the only people in the United States. And so I probably don't really think of myself as Canadian or Dutch, but really similar to Tiffany, I always kind of felt like, you know, my parents didn't go to university, let alone university in the States. And so there were kind of cultural touchstones that were familiar to a lot of my peers growing up that were just simply not familiar to me. And maybe that made me a little bit less rooted to California than some others, but I think it also gave me a bit more of a global outlook. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, California is the ultimate melting pot, isn't it? It really is. Ruth, I mean, again, I'll be interested in sort of your perspectives, because you lived abroad a lot when you were young as well, and kind of those influences on you today, beyond everything else.
I'm as you know, Rahul, I'm a passionate traveler. I love different cultures. I just love traveling. So I think my early days of Africa definitely shaped my thinking around empathy. I mean, this will show my age as well. I'd went to South Africa with the days of apartheid, and I remember thinking then, as a young person, just how terrible that was. So that my African experience definitely has shaped my world in terms of not seeing any of that. Talking to Anne-Marie's points about diversity and inclusion, I never think about it, and I've been to some parts of the US where, some of those things are very, very, very real. And I remember somebody saying something to me about a person of color, and I remember looking and thinking, you know, coming from London and having my time in Africa, I never even gave that a second thought. So I've always been, you know, really passionate about diversity and actually having, you know, friends from all walks of life. And I think that just makes you so much, you know, better as an individual. I guess, how do I identify myself? I've always identified myself as a woman. I've never, you know, and I'm proud of that. And I'm proud of the fact that, you know, somebody like me, you know, as a disabled woman, climbing to the top of an organization, if that's how you want to call it, being a leader, a CEO of an organization, you know, is incredible, really, when you think about it. I don't think about it too often, but people often tell me, because you just don't see people like me at leading, whether it's leading a FTSE 100 or FTSE 250. I've never seen anybody like me, ever. And particularly not a woman. You might see a man as a wheelchair user, but I bet you could only put them on a hand of how many of them are CEOs. So I think, you know, for me, I always say that I'm a woman. I think it's good that, you know, yeah, I never define myself by my disability. I used to say to people, never judge me by that, because that'd be the biggest mistake you make. You want to judge me by what comes out of my mouth and what's between my ears. That's what you need to judge me on, nothing else. But so many people do judge you. And, you know, fortunately or unfortunately for me, it's very visible. Many people have their crosses to bear, but, you know, that's where people don't see that. And that's where, you know, somebody like me is very easy to be judged, because, I mean, I've had people talk to people behind me, at the side of me, even today. Even with the Paralympics and all the great stuff that this country's done, even today, people still have, you know, take the opportunity to ask somebody next to me whether I'd like a cup of tea or am I okay, and those sorts of things. So, you know, wow. I think it's my duty as a woman to help other women, and I mentor 3 other women, and all of them are wheelchair users.
That's amazing, Ruth.
All with young, you know, all with fledgling careers, different industry sectors. But, you know, that nothing gives me more pride. Now, listen, I'd mentor a man if they approach me, but just happens that when they've seen me speak, the 3 people that I mentor have come up to me afterwards and said, look, will you help me in my career? And, I take that as a huge privilege.
Wow, Ruth, you're a force of nature. Tiffany.
This is a really loaded question for me. Like, how do I identify? Because I said, I spent most of my childhood, I don't know if it's defying is the right word, but I was really embarrassed about who I was on the outset, you know, being Filipino. And so I spent a lot of time trying not to be Filipino, right? So I was trying to be as whatever, Kentuckian, whatever that might look like at the time. But and then I got really embarrassed about that in college, realizing once I graduated from high school, I'm like, I'm out of here. And I went to college in Massachusetts and tried to find a more diverse university, and surrounded by people that were really proud of where they came from. And it really made me think, like, gosh, I wish I'd known, or I wish my parents actually, because I didn't grow up speaking the language at all. They also had to assimilate. So I think they had their own issues with that. So we weren't a very Filipino cultural household. But now, so now, I mean, I've been still trying to figure out what I identify as, but I think on the outset, I think of myself as Asian first, just because that's how I think people see me, and just based on other people's reactions to me, you know, it's like, I think they see Asian first. I mean, even living in the Netherlands right now, I'm not sure, do they see me as American? Do they see me as Asian first? Like, I'm not, you know, I'm still trying to figure that out. And then even with my own children, they ask me, like, what are we? Are we American? Are we Dutch? Are we Californian? I don't know. So it's like, there's all these different loaded questions about how we identify. But at the end of the day, the way that it kind of helps me to become a change maker is to really learn and impart, like, how to embrace everything about us. Like, I still don't know where I call home. I say I have an American passport. But I have to say, I feel quite at home in Amsterdam because of the community feel and the socialist, and people are helping each other out, and just sort of this great respect for community. But yeah, so I think going into my work, my identity kind of helps to embrace every bit of it, and and to help communicate to others about each other's identities, so that at the end we're not trying to separate each other or mark these differences, but rather to embrace them all. So.
Fascinating. We're all humans first, right?
Yeah.
So quick fire round. I'm going to throw a word out and then we'll work our way around the screen. On my screen, Ruth is first, then Anne-Marie, then Tiffany, and it'll come back to me. I'll throw a word out to you, and then if you can just give me your reaction to that word. It's just one word. It's not, I'm not going to do anything controversial or try to spook you or anything. Ruth, let's start with inspiration.
I mean, that means so much to me. For, you know, I've seen so many young disabled people get their wheelchair for the first time, and actually when you ask them what they're going to go and do, they go, I'm going to go and be naughty away from my mum, or I'm going to post a letter on my own. That for me is inspiration. Just to see somebody do something that they, you know, that they haven't been able to do that, and how wonderful that is to see for the family members. I mean, that inspired me every day to do a better job for those young people.
Make them feel more part of society to do everyday tasks.
Really. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Anne-Marie?
God, after today, Ruth and Tiffany. It's just amazing. It truly is inspiring for me to see all these fantastic people who are doing such amazing works and frankly changing the world. It's
you're doing that too. You're doing that too.
Yeah, I was going to say you're doing that as well.
And you have it as your day job as well as your evening job. So yeah.
Well, I feel very humbled to be here. I truly these kinds of events and this in particular is very inspiring to me. It'd be very hard for me to pinpoint something that was frankly more inspirational than to hear what Tiffany and Ruth are doing.
Oh, that's wow. That's so nice of you, Anne-Marie. Tiffany?
So I'm sorry. So inspiration, we're talking
inspiration, yeah.
I mean, I'm inspired by all the doctors and the nurses right now. I mean, I'm so focused on the pandemic and just all the people that are sacrificing their families and their lives to be able to work a lot and trying to fight this global pandemic. I mean, it's really like our present day war. You know, I was talking to my husband the other day about how, gosh, you know, we've gone through the Gulf War and 9/11 and all, but this is just such an all-encompassing thing that the whole world is facing. So that has been inspiring to me, and the teachers too. Our kids finally went back to school on Monday, which is exciting. It just is the teachers that are going and putting themselves out there. So it's been really inspiring.
Indeed.
Amazing. Motto, Ruth, what's your motto?
Treat people like I like to be treated.
Beautiful. Anne-Marie?
Oh, I'm going to go Disney. I'll say keep on swimming.
Love it.
Lovely, yeah.
Tiffany?
Never too late.
Love that. Love that. What's the one word that means the most to you, Ruth?
Oh, one word that means. I mean, I've always got hope. You know, for myself and for other people. I mean, I always think, and I generally think most human beings are kind. Most people want to do the right thing.
If hope is lost, all is lost, right? So
yeah, and if we all did just one tiny thing to change the world for somebody else, doesn't have to be a big thing, just one tiny small thing. You know, the thing that fills me with joy is when people come up to me when I'm filling up my car with petrol at a gas station. They say, "Oh, can I help you?" Before the Paralympics, most people would turn a blind eye. You know, if I had to go in and pay, there would be a step and I couldn't get in. I'd have to ask somebody. Since the Paralympics, people now come up to me and ask me, can they help me? Now, I don't need any help, but the fact that they ask me, I always make them feel good. And I say, thank you so much for asking me. I really appreciate it, because I don't want them to feel bad about asking the next person. I think if we did something tiny like that for everybody, the world would be better.
Amazing, amazing. Anne-Marie?
Respect, and it's kind of feeding into Ruth's motto, treat people as you would want to be treated. And I think genuinely treating people with respect is, I do try to live by that most days. some days are easier than others.
I bet. Tiffany.
Two really good words that I would have picked. But also perseverance is a big word for me. It's something I share with my kids as well.
I mean, that is incredible. So each of you now is going to ask the other a question. Tiffany, shall we start with you? Who's your question to?
Anne-Marie.
Yeah.
That's right? Yes.
Yes.
So it's a bit of a personal question just because something that I'm struggling with, but I'm always interested to hear how people, women in particular, are balancing out work and home life, especially since we're all working from home these days. And so, yeah, if you have any routines or tips and tricks to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and not letting work blend into your, personal life, I'd be really interested to hear that.
I wish I could say that I have been managing those boundaries really well, but it's been challenging in lockdown. So, I think at first, like the first few months, I think as with everybody, that there were no boundaries whatsoever. And I think it probably compounded because my husband and I, we have 2 dogs, but we don't have kids. And so it was just really easy to do nothing but work. But we've got much better in the last, we'll say 6 months. I'm trying to do better about getting some exercise. I bought a little Stairmaster. So if I'm not on Zoom calls, I try to do calls on the Stairmaster to just at least get some exercise. And I'm trying to be much better about shutting the computer off at a reasonable hour and making time to call friends and family as opposed to trying to Zoom them. So just getting away from the screen, but still getting that connection. And then of course I do have 2 dogs who always demand there's a ball to be thrown or a belly to be rubbed or something. And I have to say they've brought us enormous comfort in the last couple months.
For sure.
Did you get those dogs during lockdown, Anne-Marie, or did you?
No, they're not lockdown puppies, but boy, they've got spoiled and overweight in the last few months, just like the rest of us maybe. But yeah, they've become very comfortable with us home.
Amazing. Thank you, Tiffany. Anne-Marie, who's your question to?
So my question's for Ruth. And Ruth, you've worked in both the private and the charitable sectors, and I really just would love to understand the lessons you've drawn and the skills you've brought across from one side to the other, and what's been most different about working at WizKids and at Leonard Cheshire.
Oh, I mean, I think a lot of the skills are exactly the same, if I'm honest with you. I think, I had a tech career. So, I guess when I first moved into the charity sector, tech wasn't high up on the agenda. And so I was a little bit like, how am I going to cope without all, having tech to my fingertips? Now, we could argue we've got so much tech now, but thank goodness we have, because we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing today. I guess, so I've always I think they've crossed over. I think I'd like to think in the charity sector, we've got that human touch, clearly, because we're doing such invaluable work. So, for me, it's all about the people. My role as Leonard Cheshire, for me, it's about 2 things. It's about our customers and it's about our people. And so we're a people business. I always say that to people, we're a people business. And I think if you start with your customer, I'm sure in all of your industry sectors, it's no different, is it? So I would say they're very much the same, but for me, it's a very strong emphasis on people.
Great, thanks.
I mean, Ruth, relating that question back to what we said before, do you think the charity sector is much more emotional and the business sector is much more rational?
Yeah, I do think there's a bit of that. Yeah, I do, Rahul. I think, I would say that.
Okay, and Ruth, your question?
So mine's to Tiffany, and it's, do you think we're doing enough in the developing world for disabled girls?
See, the short answer to that is no. I don't think, never enough until everybody has access, right? But I do feel like in the developing world, girls in general just have a harder time because of social norms and the expectations that society has for women and girls to be at home and to raise families. So that that's a challenge. But then when you look at it in an intersectional lens, you know, girls in rural areas and low income families, minorities, and girls with disabilities that have even a harder time and less access. But there are a lot of good organizations out there like UNICEF and Plan International, Leonard, Cheshire, doing really good targeted work for girls with disabilities, but obviously we can do more. And I'd like to see be more mainstreamed into just all programs, you know, even like with Scientific Adventures for Girls, you know, we're targeting girls, but sometimes our strategy wasn't looking at, okay, are we getting enough girls from these communities? Are we getting enough girls from, you know, with, you know, this ethnic background or disabilities, and, you know, it through an intersectional lens. And I think we need to do more with these programs and to have it mainstream so that we're looking at it. But I think the good news is the pandemic has really shown us what inequities actually existed before the pandemic. It's a real opportunity for us to rethink how we're doing things and how we can move forward without leaving people behind. And it's changing how we collect data. There's not a lot of data on girls' access and girls' access to education or whatnot in the developing world. We know anecdotally that there's appallingly low percentage of girls that are in school, girls with disabilities. But I think the way that we're collecting data and more disaggregated, it's going to show that evidence. And I think we're really going to start to see more work and effort and solutions to these issues.
That's wonderful. I mean, there's clearly a lot of synergies here between the work that you all do, Ruth and Tiffany, I mean, on international disability, Tiffany and Anne-Marie on STEM and promoting girls on education, Anne-Marie and Ruth on trying to get young women who are disadvantaged into the investment industry, whether they're disabled, able-bodied. So there's a lot of synergies here, and it really warms my heart. And I think that's one thing that I think that more non-for-profits should collaborate and do more work together, because quite often people are focused in their silos, aren't they? And they don't see the wider picture. So, I've got two more questions left for you. The first one is, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self today? And then if you've got a message for the investment community, either about your mission or a message you would like to say to them about their collective consciousness and what they can do for the world, what would it be? We'll start with you, Tiffany, this time, please.
Okay, so what advice I would give to my 18-year-old self? I would say, looking back, I would tell myself to really be self-aware and to base your decisions on what you want to do and and not what you think you should do. Because I feel like, I mean, although I'm now here and I feel grateful that I can now tell those things apart a bit, I think I wasted a lot of time doing things that I thought I should be doing. So just go for it. Just figure out what you want and do it. Yeah.
And your message to the investment community, please.
The investment community. Yes, I think one thing that I would say to the investment community is to take a look at how to invest in hiring more women in these STEM fields, and putting in more systems. Yeah, investing in looking at companies through an ESG lens and see which companies are looking at these issues carefully, and like looking at women on boards, women decision makers, and really taking that into account when engaging in new investments.
Brilliant, thank you. Ruth?
My younger self at 18, well, do you know what? If I knew where I'd be now at 18, I think I probably would have cried, because I probably would never have thought it was ever possible.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's all about, I tried desperately hard to educate people around me, educate employers, educate everybody that met me about that I was no different. And the fact that I had to spend all that time doing that, I think is exhausting. So for me, I probably would have tried less to fit in. Does that make sense? And actually be proud of being different. But back then, different was not acceptable. I knew that when I got my first job, if I did not, and I had no formal education, so if I did not work harder than my colleague and not have any time sick, that was the only way I was going to keep my job. So, if I look at myself at 18, I'd probably, if I go backwards, I probably would have, I would cry, because I would never have thought it'd been possible. And what would I tell your industry sector? I'd say, invest in women and invest in employment of disabled people. See the purple pound as something that's really important, and actually look at organizations that are going to have a purpose about them for good.
That's your biggest challenge, isn't it? I mean, all the years that I've known you, you've always said the biggest challenge is trying to fund young, smart, disabled people opportunities, even if it's just work experience, not just even employment. So that's a big shout out, I guess, to everyone in the industry, please. That would be wonderful if you can help us achieve that.
And don't allow the recruitment agencies that are often the gatekeepers to the when you get to the employers, and it's people's unconscious bias, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And finally, Anne-Marie, I mean, you work in this industry and you're also doing a huge amount to change this industry. So I'd love your perspectives on both of those questions, please.
Yeah, so for my 18-year-old self, I mean, looking back, and it actually touches a bit on Tiffany's point with her daughter being maybe not so confident in maths, is there was so much pressure, or I put so much pressure on myself at 18 to be perfect at everything. And I think that ultimately that meant I took less risks, wasn't maybe as I didn't push myself hard enough out of the box because I was too afraid to fail. And so my lesson would be, or the advice I'd give myself is, don't be afraid to say what you think and to fail. And if you recognize that growth actually comes from failure, if we acknowledge it as a lesson and not as a catastrophe, it's actually a really great opportunity. And so that would be the advice I'd give my 18-year-old self, is just to take not be so concerned about being perfect and be willing to take risk. And the advice I would give for the investment community actually touches really well onto the points made especially by Ruth, is one of the things we try to encourage employers to do is to look outside of like the traditional economics and finance majors and look at other parts of at students in other disciplines, because some of the best investors I've met over the last 25 years have been history majors and linguistics majors. They haven't been finance and accounting majors. And there's a huge amount of talent if we actually just look outside of the little narrow slice that we kind of all tend to focus on.
That's wonderful. Ruth, Anne-Marie, Tiffany, thank you all so much for doing this for us, for iConnections for hosting us, and happy International Women's Day week to everyone. And everyone, please stay safe and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.